Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we move gently toward the light, toward a figure who was not born in darkness nor shaped by chaos, but who arrived with clarity, with radiance, with a quiet and unwavering presence. Before there were temples raised in his honor, before music carried his name across valleys and mountains, before prophecies were whispered in hushed tones, there was only a distant island and a mother in search of refuge. Her name was Leto, and she wandered the world alone. Pursued, unwelcome, denied rest by nearly every land she approached. For Leto carried within her something powerful, something that had already begun to reshape the balance of the divine world. She was pregnant with the children of Zeus, and this alone made her a target, because Hera, queen of the gods, did not forgive easily. Wherever Leto went, the earth itself seemed to reject her. Solid ground refused to hold her. Cities turned her away. Even the most remote corners of the world hesitated to offer shelter. It was not simply fear, but something deeper, a quiet understanding that the birth of these children would shift something fundamental. And so, Leto wandered across hills, along shorelines, beneath wide and empty skies, until at last she found a place that was not quite like the others. A small, floating island, untethered, drifting upon the sea. Its name was Delos. It was not fixed to the earth, not bound by roots or stone, and because of this, it had never belonged to anyone. It was overlooked, unclaimed, and perhaps because of that, it was free. Delos did not turn her away, and there, at the edge of the world, beneath open sky and surrounded by endless water, Leto finally found stillness. It was here that she gave birth, first to Artemis, quiet and watchful, a presence already tied to the wilderness and the night, and then to Apollo. His arrival was not marked by violence, nor by thunder, nor by conflict, but by light. A quiet, steady, unmistakable light. It spread across the island, touching the water, the sky, the distant horizon. And in that moment, something changed. Apollo was not merely another god among many. He carried with him a sense of order, of clarity, of understanding. Where others ruled through force, or fear, or desire, Apollo would rule through something else entirely, through perception, through knowledge, through the ability to see not only what is, but what will be, as he grew, this nature became clear. Apollo was drawn not to chaos, but to patterns, not to conflict, but to harmony. He moved through the world with a kind of quiet certainty, as though the structure of reality itself was something he could feel, something he could hear, like music. And in many ways, that is exactly what it was. Because to Apollo, the world was not random. It was composed. Every movement, every cycle, every rising and falling, part of something larger, something older. And it was this understanding that would come to define him. He became the god of light. Not only the light of the sun, though that would later become his domain, but the light of awareness, of seeing clearly. He became the god of music. Not simply sound, but harmony. The alignment of things that might otherwise remain separate. And he became the god of prophecy, perhaps the most mysterious of all, because prophecy is not control. It is not the power to change the future, but the ability to perceive it, to see the unfolding of events before they arrive, to understand the shape of things before they take form. And this is where Apollo becomes something more than a figure of myth. Because in his presence, we begin to see a different kind of power. Not force, not domination, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from stepping back, from observing, from listening. And in this way, Apollo stands apart. He does not rush. He does not overwhelm. He reveals slowly, gently, but with precision, like light at dawn, spreading across the horizon. Not all at once, but inevitably. And as we follow his story, we begin to move deeper into that light, toward a place where music and meaning intertwine, where prophecy is not simply prediction, but understanding, and where the quiet order of the world becomes something we can almost begin to hear. As Apollo grew, there was a quiet sense that he did not simply belong to the world, but that he was beginning to shape it, not through force, not through conquest, but through something more subtle, something that unfolded almost without resistance. There are stories of gods who battled for their place, who struggled to claim their domain. Apollo did not struggle. He arrived, and things aligned around him. But even for a god of light, there were shadows that needed to be faced. And one of the first of these lay not far from where he had been born, at the base of Mount Parnassus, near a place that would one day become sacred to him, there lived a creature older than his influence, a serpent, vast and ancient, known as Python. Python was not merely a beast, but a presence, something tied to the deep and hidden parts of the earth, to what lay beneath the surface. It guarded a place of power, a place where the boundary between the known and the unknown felt thinner, where something could be sensed, but not yet understood. For a long time, this place remained untouched, undefined. But Apollo, even in his youth, was drawn to it, because where others might have seen danger, he sensed something else, potential, not for destruction, but for transformation. And so he approached. There is something almost quiet about this moment, something different from the dramatic battles told of other gods, because this was not chaos meeting chaos. It was clarity meeting something older, something more instinctive, something rooted deep within the earth itself. Python did not yield, and Apollo did not retreat. What followed was not simply a battle, but a turning point, a moment where one form of power gave way to another, where something ancient and undefined was replaced by something older, something understood. Apollo struck with precision, not rage, and when the serpent fell, the place it had guarded did not disappear. It changed. What had once been a site of uncertainty, of hidden forces, became something else entirely. It became Delphi, a place that would come to be known across the world, not for fear, but for insight. For here, Apollo did something remarkable. He did not seal away the unknown. He gave it a voice. At Delphi, a priestess would sit, breathing slowly, speaking words that seemed to rise from somewhere beyond ordinary understanding. And those who came, kings, travelers, seekers of all kinds, would ask their questions, not knowing what answer they would receive, because prophecy is not comfort. It does not always give clarity in the way we expect. Often, it reveals truth in fragments, in symbols, in ways that require patience and interpretation. And this is where Apollo's nature becomes even more clear. He did not offer certainty. He offered awareness, the ability to see patterns, to sense direction, to understand that the future is not fixed, but unfolding, that what we call destiny is not something imposed upon us, but something we move toward, step by step, often without realizing. At Delphi, this idea took form. People would travel great distances, carrying questions they could not answer on their own, and they would leave, not always with solutions, but with something deeper, a shift in perspective, a sense that the world was not random, but structured, interconnected, that events, even the smallest ones, were part of something larger. And in this way, Apollo's influence spread, not as a force that controlled the world, but as one that revealed it. But Apollo was not only a god of prophecy. There was another side to him, one that moved not through words, but through sound, through music. To understand this, we have to imagine a world before harmony was fully understood, before sound was shaped into something intentional, before music carried emotion, meaning, connection. Apollo changed that. He was often depicted holding a lyre, a simple instrument, yet one capable of producing something extraordinary. When Apollo played, it was said that even nature would pause. Winds would soften, waters would still, and those who listened would feel something settle within them. Because music, in its purest form, is not just sound, it is pattern, it is structure. It is the organization of time itself into something that can be felt. And this is deeply connected to Apollo's nature, because just as he brought order to prophecy, he brought order to sound, turning noise into harmony, turning randomness into something that could be understood, even without words. There is a story, quiet and almost easily overlooked, but important, one in which Apollo receives his lyre in arms. Hermes, clever, unpredictable, a god of movement and change, had created the instrument from a tortoise shell, something simple, transformed into something capable of beauty. And when Apollo received it, he did not merely accept it, he perfected it. He refined its sound, its structure, its purpose. And in doing so, he established something lasting. Music became not just expression, but balance, a way of bringing the internal world, thoughts, emotions, into alignment. And perhaps this is why Apollo feels so different from many of the other gods, because his influence is not loud. It does not demand attention. It invites it, gently, steadily, like a melody that draws you in without effort. And as we continue to follow his story, we begin to see that Apollo is not defined by a single domain. but by a principle, the movement from chaos to clarity, from noise to harmony, from uncertainty to awareness. And this movement, though ancient, is something that still feels familiar, because even now we seek the same things: understanding, balance, meaning. And in the quiet unfolding of Apollo's story, we begin to sense how these things are connected, not as distant ideas, but as something present, something always just beneath the surface, waiting, like a melody not yet heard, or a truth not yet fully seen. As Apollo's presence spread outward from Delphi, and as his music began to shape the world in quieter, more subtle ways, another aspect of his nature began to reveal itself. Because light, for all its clarity, is not always gentle. It illuminates, but it also exposes. It brings warmth, but it can also burn. And Apollo, though often remembered for harmony, carried within him this same duality. He was not only a bringer of balance, but also a force capable of disruption. There is a story, one that unfolds not in temples or sacred spaces, but among people in the ordinary world, where pride and skill and identity begin to intertwine. It is the story of Marsyas. Marsyas was not a god. He was a satyr, a creature of the wild, deeply connected to nature, instinctive, expressive, unrefined in the way that the natural world often is. And yet, he possessed something remarkable. He was a musician, but not in the way Apollo was, where Apollo's music was structured, measured, precise. Marsyas' music was different. It was raw, emotional, untamed. He played the aulos, a wind instrument, its sound fuller, deeper, almost primal, and those who heard it felt something immediate, not calm, not order, but intensity, a stirring, something that rose from within rather than settling into stillness. And for a time, this was enough. Marsyas became known, admired, even celebrated for his skill. But admiration, when left unchecked, can begin to change. It can become comparison. And comparison, slowly, almost invisibly, becomes challenge. Marsyas began to believe, or perhaps to wonder, whether his music was not just different from Apollo's, but better. And so, he did something few would dare. He challenged Apollo himself to a contest. It is easy to imagine this moment as bold, even reckless, but beneath it, there is something more human, a desire to be seen, to be recognized, to measure oneself against something greater. And Apollo did not refuse, because this too is part of his nature. Clarity does not avoid confrontation. It meets it. The contest was set. Judges were chosen. In some tellings, the muses themselves, embodiments of art and knowledge, those who understood not just sound, but meaning. Marsyas played first, and his music filled the space. It moved like wind through trees, like rushing water, unpredictable, alive. It stirred something deep, something instinctive. It was powerful. But when Apollo played, the world seemed to shift. His music was not louder, not more forceful, but it carried something else. Structure, precision, a sense that every note belonged exactly where it was. And more than that, Apollo did something Marsyas could not. He sang as he played, layering voice and instrument together, expanding the very definition of what music could be. And in that moment, the outcome became clear. The judges chose Apollo, not because Marsyas lacked talent, but because Apollo's music represented something broader, a synthesis, the union of emotion and order, of feeling and understanding. Marsyas lost, and what followed is often told as harsh, even unsettling, because Apollo, in victory, did not simply walk away. He punished Marsyas severely, a reminder, perhaps, that the gods were not bound by the same limits as mortals. That power, even when tied to clarity, could still act without mercy. And yet, even here, there is something to reflect on, because this story is not only about punishment, it is about contrast, about two ways of experiencing the world, one rooted in instinct, the other in structure, one flowing freely, the other shaped with intention. And Apollo stands not as a rejection of the first, but as a transformation of it, a movement toward balance. But balance, as we begin to see, is not always gentle. It requires boundaries. It requires limits. And sometimes it requires endings. This duality appears again in another part of Apollo's story. one that feels quieter, more distant, yet equally powerful. Because Apollo was not only associated with music and prophecy, but also with healing and with disease, a paradox that at first seems difficult to understand. How can the same figure bring both restoration and harm? But when we look more closely, the connection begins to emerge. Apollo was believed to carry arrows, invisible, precise, and when he released them, they could bring sudden illness, a fever, a weakness, something that seemed to appear without warning. But just as easily, he could withhold them or guide healing, often through his son, Asclepius, who would later become the god of medicine. And here, we begin to see something deeper, because Apollo does not represent sickness, nor healing alone. He represents awareness, the understanding that the body, like the world, follows patterns. That imbalance leads to disruption, and that restoration requires alignment. This is not unlike music, where a single note out of place can shift everything, and where harmony is not the absence of sound, but the careful arrangement of it. And so, Apollo's influence extends even further into the unseen rhythms of life itself, into the rise and fall of health, the cycles of strength and recovery. And this is why, across the ancient world, he was not feared alone, but respected, sought after, because to understand Apollo was to understand something fundamental. That clarity is not always comfortable, but it is necessary. And as his story continues to unfold, we begin to see that even he, a god of light, of perception, of harmony, was not untouched by longing, by desire, by the quiet, often unfulfilled pull towards something just out of reach. And it is there, in those moments, that Apollo becomes something even more familiar. Not just a symbol, but a presence, one that reflects something within us, the search for balance, for meaning, for something that feels complete, but is always just beyond our grasp. And so, even as Apollo brought order to the world, even as his music settled the air and his presence shaped places of meaning, there remained something within him that was not fully resolved. Because clarity, for all its strength, does not prevent longing and light, though it reveals so much, cannot always hold what it reaches for. There is a story, quieter than the clash of voices, yet in many ways more human. A story not of victory, but of pursuit, of desire and distance, of something seen before, but never truly grasped. It begins, as many things do, with a moment that seems small, almost incidental, a passing interaction. Apollo, confident in his strength, in his precision, in the certainty of his aim, encountered Eros, the god of desire. Small, often underestimated, but powerful in ways that were not always immediately visible. Apollo, in that moment, spoke lightly, perhaps dismissively, questioning what such a small figure could truly accomplish, comparing his own skill with the bow to what he believed was lesser. It was not cruelty, exactly, but it was enough, because Eros does not respond with force. He responds with inevitability, with something far more subtle. 2 arrows, nearly identical in form, yet entirely different in effect. One tipped with gold, the other with lead. The golden arrow awakens desire, an immediate, undeniable pull. The lead arrow does the opposite. It turns the heart away, creates distance, resistance, a quiet and unwavering refusal. Eros released them both. The golden arrow found Apollo. The lead arrow found Daphne. And from that moment, the world shifted. Apollo, who had moved through existence with clarity, with understanding, with a sense of control, now felt something unfamiliar. A pull, not of logic, not of pattern, but of longing, immediate, consuming, impossible to ignore. And Daphne felt something just as strong, but in the opposite direction. Where Apollo moved toward her, she moved away, not out of fear alone, but from something deeper, a certainty that what followed him was not something she could accept. Daphne was not a figure of cities or temples. She belonged to the natural world, to forests, to rivers, to open space. She valued independence, movement, freedom. And so, when Apollo approached, with words, with presence, with the full weight of his attention, she turned and she ran. There is something almost quiet about this chase, not chaotic, not frantic in the way one might expect, but steady, inevitable. Apollo followed, not with anger, but with urgency, trying to close a distance that never seemed to lessen. And Daphne moved through the landscape with familiarity, weaving between trees, across uneven ground, always just beyond reach. The space between them remained constant, a reflection, perhaps, of something deeper. Because this was never truly about distance. It was about alignment, or rather, the lack of it. Apollo's desire, though real, though powerful, was not shared, and no amount of movement, no matter how persistent, could change that. And so the chase continued, through sunlight and shadow, through stillness and motion, until, at last, Daphne felt the boundary approaching, the edge of what she could sustain. And in that moment, she did something that feels both sudden and deeply inevitable. She called out, not to Apollo, but to the earth itself, to the forces that had always held her, that had always understood her. She asked not for escape, but for transformation. And the world responded, not with resistance, but with change. Her movement slowed, not from exhaustion, but from something else. Her feet rooted, her skin shifting, softness giving way to something more solid, more still. Her arms reaching upward, becoming branches. Her hair spreading into leaves. And Apollo, arriving just as this transformation completed, reached out only to find not the person he had pursued, but a tree, a laurel, still, quiet, unmoving, and yet not entirely gone, because something of Daphne remained, not in form, but in presence. Apollo, standing there, in the aftermath of something he could not undo, something he could not change, did not react with anger, nor with denial, but with recognition, a quiet understanding that not all things, even when seen clearly, can be held. That desire, even when strong, does not guarantee connection. And so he did something else, something that feels almost like acceptance. He took the leaves of the laurel and made them sacred. From that moment forward, the laurel became his symbol, worn as a crown, not of conquest, but of remembrance, of something that existed and could not remain. And in this, the story shifts, because it is no longer simply about pursuit, but about transformation, about the ways in which longing, when unmet, does not disappear, but changes, becomes something quieter, something carried, something woven into identity. Apollo, the god of clarity, of light, of understanding, now carried within him something unresolved, a reminder that even the most ordered existence contains moments that cannot be shaped, that cannot be predicted, that cannot be aligned. And perhaps this is why his presence feels so complete, because it is not without imperfection. It is not untouched by distance, but transforms it. And as we continue, we begin to see Apollo not just as a figure of balance, but as one who understands that even within harmony, there are notes that can never fully resolve, and that sometimes it is those very notes that give the music its depth. And after moments of pursuit, of transformation, of things that could not be held, Apollo's story begins to move into something quieter, less defined by individual events, and more by presence, by something that is not confined to a single place or a single moment, but that unfolds again and again in a rhythm that feels almost familiar, because over time Apollo became associated with something even more constant, more enduring, the sun. Not in the earliest tellings, not at the beginning of his story, but gradually, almost naturally, as his nature became more clearly understood, because there had long been a figure tied to the sun, Helios, who carried it across the sky in a chariot of fire, rising each morning, crossing the heavens, and descending again at dusk, a steady and unwavering cycle. But as the world of myth continued to take shape, as meanings shifted and identities began to overlap, Apollo, with his connection to light, to clarity, to perception, began to take on this role, not replacing Helios entirely, but becoming something more symbolic, less about the physical act of carrying the sun, and more about what the sun represents: light, time, awareness, because the sun does more than illuminate. It defines the structure of the day. It creates rhythm: morning, afternoon, evening, night. A pattern so consistent, so deeply embedded, that we rarely stop to consider it. And yet, it shapes everything. When we wake, when we rest, when we move, when we pause, and in this way, Apollo's presence becomes something constant, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like the gradual light of dawn. There is no single moment where darkness disappears. It softens slowly. Edges become visible. Shapes begin to form, until the world is clear again. And then, just as gently, the process reverses. Light fades, colors deepen, movement slows, and night returns. This cycle, simple as it may seem, holds something profound, because it reminds us that everything moves, not randomly, but in patterns, that even change follows structure. And Apollo, as a symbol of this light, becomes tied not only to visibility, but to understanding, to the idea that clarity is not constant. It comes and it goes. There are moments when things are easy to see, and moments when they are not, and both are part of the same cycle. This is perhaps why Apollo's presence feels so steady, because he does not resist these changes. He reflects them. He represents the movement itself, the quiet unfolding of time, measured not in urgency, but in repetition, day after day. Light rising, light falling, and within that rhythm, something begins to settle. Because when patterns are consistent, they create a kind of calm, a sense that even without control, there is structure, there is continuity, there is something reliable. And this is where Apollo's connection to music returns. Because rhythm, whether in sound or in time, follows the same principle. It is not the absence of variation, but the presence of order within it, a steady pulse that allows everything else to exist around it. And so, the rising of the sun, the passing of hours, the shifting of light across a room, all of it becomes part of something larger, a composition unfolding continuously. And Apollo is not separate from this. He is woven into it, not as a force that directs every moment, but as a presence that reflects its structure. And when we begin to see this, even in a quiet and distant way, something changes. The world feels less random, less scattered, because beneath everything, there is rhythm, even in stillness, even in rest. There is movement, slow, almost imperceptible, but always there. And this realization, simple as it may seem, has a way of softening things, of easing the need to understand everything all at once, because not everything is meant to be seen in a single moment. Some things reveal themselves gradually, like light at dawn, or like a melody, unfolding one note at a time. And in this way, Apollo's story becomes less about events and more about experience, about the quiet awareness of time passing, of patterns repeating, of the steady movement from one moment into the next, without urgency, without force, just continuing. And within this steady rhythm of light, of time, of quiet and repeating cycles, there emerges another aspect of Apollo, one that feels both gentle and deeply powerful, because if light reveals, and if clarity allows us to see, then what follows is understanding, and from understanding comes the possibility of healing. Apollo was not only a god of music, or prophecy, or the quiet unfolding of time. He was also connected to something far more immediate, the fragile balance of the human body, the subtle line between illness and restoration, between weakness and strength. And this connection did not exist in isolation. It continued through another figure, his son, Asclepius. There is something almost quiet about the beginning of this story, because Asclepius was not born into ease. His mother, Coronis, was mortal, and like many stories that bridge the divine and the human, this one carries both creation and loss. When Apollo learned that Coronis had been unfaithful, the response was swift and irreversible. A moment of anger, of judgment, and yet even within that moment, something remained. Because before her life was fully gone, Apollo intervened. He saved the child, drawn from the edge of loss into something that would continue. Asclepius, raised not among ordinary people, but taught, guided, shaped by knowledge that extended beyond the visible. He learned the structure of the body, the patterns of illness, the ways in which imbalance could be recognized, and slowly, carefully restored. There is something deeply fitting in this, because just as Apollo brought order to music, to prophecy, to time, Asclepius brought order to the body, understanding that health was not random, but a balance, a system, a quiet alignment of many parts working together. And over time, his skill grew, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like everything connected to Apollo, measured, precise, deliberate. He learned how to ease pain, how to reduce suffering, how to guide the body back toward equilibrium. And those who came to him did not come for spectacle. They came for relief, for restoration, for the quiet hope that something within them could be made whole again. But as his knowledge deepened, as his understanding expanded, he began to approach something far more complex, something that sits at the edge of all healing, the boundary between life and death, because healing, in its earliest form, is about preservation, maintaining balance, preventing decline. But Asclepius began to move beyond this, toward reversal, toward bringing back what had already been lost. There are stories that he was able to restore life itself, to reach beyond the final boundary and return someone from death. And in that moment, something shifted, because this was not simply healing, it was disruption, not of the body, but of the order that governed existence itself. And here, Apollo's influence becomes more complex, because clarity and knowledge, when extended beyond their natural limits, can begin to challenge the very structure they once supported. Who maintained balance at the highest level saw this not as progress, but as a fracture, a point where the natural rhythm of life and death, of beginning and ending, was no longer being followed. And so he intervened, but with finality, a single strike, lightning, and Asclepius was gone. There is something still about this moment, not dramatic, not prolonged, just decisive, and in its stillness, something else becomes clear. Because this is not simply a story of loss, it is a story of limits, of the boundaries that exist, even within knowledge, even within clarity, even within the desire to heal. Apollo, who had brought so much into alignment, who had guided understanding across so many domains, was now faced with something that could not be resolved. The loss of his son, not through chaos, but through order, through the enforcement of balance. And this creates a tension, one that is rarely spoken directly, because Apollo, the god of structure, of harmony, of clarity, now stood within a moment that felt anything but harmonious. And yet, even here, the pattern remains, because what follows is not collapse, not destruction, but continuation. Asclepius, though gone, did not disappear entirely. He became something else, a symbol, a representation of healing itself. His staff, entwined with a serpent, became a lasting image, one that still exists, even now, a reminder that healing is not about control, but about balance, that life, though precious, is not separate from death, but connected to it, part of the same cycle. And Apollo, through this, becomes something even more layered, not only a bringer of light, but a witness to its limits, not only a guide toward understanding, but a reminder that not everything can be resolved. And perhaps this is where his presence becomes most meaningful, because it is easy to associate clarity with certainty, with answers, with control. But Apollo shows us something different, that clarity sometimes is simply the ability to see things as they are, even when they cannot be changed, even when they do not align, even when they carry loss. And in that seeing, there is a different kind of balance, one that does not come from fixing, but from understanding, from allowing, from recognizing the patterns, even when they are difficult. And as his story continues, we begin to feel this more clearly. that Apollo is not only a god of light, but of awareness itself, of perception, of the quiet recognition of how things move, how they begin, how they change, and how, inevitably, they come to rest. And after moments shaped by knowledge, by boundaries, by the quiet recognition of what cannot be undone, Apollo's story moves again, not toward power or prophecy or even understanding, but toward something far more delicate: connection. Because even a presence as steady as Apollo, even one so deeply aligned with clarity and rhythm and light, is not untouched by companionship, by the quiet pull of another presence. Something shared rather than observed. There is a story, one that unfolds not in tension or pursuit, but in ease. A story that carries not urgency, but warmth. It is the story of Hyacinthus. Hyacinthus was not a god, but a mortal youth. And yet, there was something about him that drew Apollo's attention, not in the sudden way of desire, not in the restless movement of longing, but in something calmer, something that felt balanced. He was said to be graceful, thoughtful, present, the kind of presence that does not disrupt, but complements. And when Apollo spent time with him, something shifted, because this was not a chase. There was no distance being closed, no resistance, only companionship. They walked together, spoke without urgency, shared time without the need to shape it into anything more. And in those moments, Apollo, who so often existed as observer, as guide, as something slightly removed, became something else, simply present. There is something deeply still about this, because it reflects a different kind of harmony, not the structured harmony of music, but the quiet alignment between two beings existing side by side, without force, without imbalance. And as time passed, their connection deepened, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like light shifting across the sky, subtle, steady, almost unnoticeable, until it is fully there. And one day, in a moment that felt simple, almost ordinary, they stood together in an open field, the air calm, the world quiet around them, and they chose to pass the time in something physical, something light, a game. Apollo, with the same precision he brought to everything, lifted a discus, smooth, circular, balanced in his hand. He cast it forward, not with force meant to harm, but with the natural motion of movement, of play. The discus cut through the air, spinning, reflecting light, a perfect arc. And Hyacinthus, watching, stepped forward, not with hesitation, but with curiosity, with engagement. And in that moment, something shifted, because even in a world shaped by order, by clarity, by understanding, there are always elements that cannot be controlled. The wind, subtle, nearly invisible, moving, just enough. The path of the discus changed, not dramatically, but enough, and in a single, quiet instant, what had been a moment of play became something else entirely. The discus struck Hyacinthus. There is no chaos in this moment, no drawn-out tension, only stillness. As movement comes to an end, as presence becomes absence, Apollo, stepping forward, immediately, not with confusion, not with delay, but with recognition. Because clarity does not soften reality, it reveals it. And what he saw was not something that could be undone, not something that could be adjusted or corrected, but something final. Hyacinthus, fading, the life that had been so quietly aligned, slipping away, and Apollo, who had understood so much, who had brought order to so many things, faced once again with something beyond his reach. There is a stillness here, different from the stillness of dawn, or music, or reflection, a heavier stillness, one that settles, that lingers, and in that space, Apollo does not react with force. He does not attempt to reverse what has happened, because he has already learned the limits of that. Instead, he remains present, witnessing. And as Hyacinthus fades, something changes, not in the world, but in how Apollo carries it. Because, once again, we see that transformation does not always come through action. Sometimes it comes through remembrance through the quiet decision to let something continue in another form. From the place where Hyacinthus fell, a flower emerged, delicate yet enduring, its petals marked in some tellings with the shape of grief itself, a quiet symbol of something that once was. And Apollo, seeing this, did not turn away. He honored it, gave it meaning, allowed it to remain, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. And in this, the story becomes something more than loss. It becomes reflection, because once again, Apollo, the god of light, of clarity, of understanding, is not untouched by what cannot be changed, but shaped by it, not diminished, but deepened. And this, perhaps, is what makes his presence feel so complete, because it is not defined only by harmony, but by the moments where harmony breaks, and how those moments are carried forward, not erased, not corrected, but remembered. And in that remembrance, something new emerges, something quieter, but lasting, like a note that lingers, even after the music has ended. And as we begin to reach the outer edges of Apollo's story, what becomes most clear is not any single event, not Delphi, not the lyre, not the sun or prophecy, or even the moments of loss that shaped him, but the pattern that connects them all, because Apollo is not defined by one domain. He is defined by a principle, a way of understanding the world, one that appears again and again across everything he touches. In Delphi, that principle becomes prophecy, not prediction, but interpretation. The understanding that truth is rarely direct. That meaning often arrives in fragments, requiring patience, awareness, and reflection. In music, that same principle becomes harmony, the shaping of sound into structure, the transformation of noise into something that can be understood, not through explanation, but through experience. In healing, it becomes balance, the recognition that the body, like the world, operates in systems. That illness is not random, but the result of disruption. And that restoration is not force, but alignment. Even in the sun, that principle continues, because The sun is not simply light, it is rhythm. It is the structure of time itself, the steady repetition that gives shape to existence. Morning, day, evening, night. Not as separate events, but as parts of a continuous movement. And across all of these, Apollo remains consistent, not loud, not chaotic, not overwhelming, but precise, measured, clear. And this is what makes him distinct, because many figures in mythology represent power, force, change through disruption. But Apollo represents something quieter and in many ways more enduring. Change through understanding, through awareness, through the gradual movement from confusion into clarity. And this is why his presence is often described as light, not simply because of the sun, but because light reveals. It does not alter what is there. It allows it to be seen, and in that seeing, something shifts, because once something is understood, it cannot return to being unknown. This is the nature of clarity. It is not always comfortable. It does not always bring resolution, but it changes perception. And Apollo exists within that space, between what is hidden and what is seen, between uncertainty and awareness. There is also something else, something quieter, but just as important, because across the story, we see not only understanding, but limitation. Moments where knowledge does not lead to control, where clarity does not prevent loss, where perception does not allow change. Daphne, Hyacinthus, Asclepius, each one a reflection of this boundary, a reminder that even the most ordered existence is not without moments that cannot be resolved. And yet, Apollo does not turn away from these moments. He does not reject them. He incorporates them, transforms them. The laurel, the flower, the symbol, each one a way of carrying something forward, not as it was, but as it can remain. And this too is part of his nature, because understanding is not only about seeing clearly, it is also about accepting what is seen without resistance, without the need to reshape it. And this is where Apollo's story begins to feel less like mythology and more like something familiar, because the movement from confusion to clarity, from imbalance to alignment, from questioning to understanding, is not limited to the ancient world. It is something that continues quietly, constantly, in every moment of observation, in every attempt to make sense of something complex, in every pause where we step back and see a little more clearly than before. And like Apollo, that clarity does not arrive all at once. It unfolds gradually, layer by layer, like light at dawn, or like a melody, revealing itself over time. And perhaps this is why his presence feels so steady, because it is not tied to a single moment. It is tied to a process, one that continues regardless of outcome, regardless of certainty. A quiet unfolding of awareness, of perception, of understanding. And as we begin to step away from his story, there is a sense not of ending, but of continuation, because the patterns he represents do not stop. They remain in the rhythm of the day, in the structure of thought, in the quiet recognition of how things connect. And even now, as the world softens, as the edges of thought begin to blur, as attention drifts gently toward rest, that same pattern continues. Slowly, steadily, without effort, like light fading at the end of the day, not disappearing, but shifting into something quieter, something softer, something that does not need to be followed, only experienced. And in that stillness, there is nothing to solve, nothing to reach for, nothing to hold, only the quiet sense that everything is moving, as it always has, in rhythm, in balance, in a pattern that continues, whether we observe it or simply rest within it.